The word hit Louise Gentry like a bucket of ice water pulled from a winter well. Useless. David Keene said it quietly, without cruelty, without even the dignity of raising his voice. He stood at the edge of his porch with his back half-turned toward her, one boot propped on the lowest railing, his eyes fixed on the rolling grassland of his ranch as though she were already gone. The sunset behind him bled red and amber across the Wyoming sky, and the beauty of it felt like a personal insult to Louise, because nothing about this moment deserved to be beautiful. "I beg your pardon," she managed, her voice climbing half an octave despite every effort to keep it steady. He finally looked at her then, dark eyes under the shadow of a worn hat brim, a jaw that could have been carved from the same red rock that jutted out of the hillside behind the barn. He was 32 years old and looked every day of it, not in a broken way, but in the way that iron looks seasoned when it has been through fire and come out harder on the other side. "I said," David repeated, with that same devastating quietness, "I have no use for a refined woman on this ranch, Miss Gentry. I should have been clearer when I wrote the advertisement. The advertisement." Those two words landed with the full weight of betrayal, because they reminded Louise of exactly why she was standing on this porch in the first place, 800 miles from the parlor in Philadelphia, where she had read that notice in the back pages of the Gazette, beside the livestock prices and the weather reports, as though the prospect of a wife were just another item to be purchased and delivered. She had come here by choice. She had come here knowing it was a forced choice, the kind that arrives dressed up as freedom, but is really just a narrowing of impossible options until only one door remains. She had come here, and now he was standing there with his back half-turned and his jaw set like a man who had already made up his mind, calling her useless. Louise Gentry was 26 years old. She had buried her father 3 months prior. She had sold the house on Sycamore Street to cover his debts. She had watched the last of her mother's silver go at auction to a man who wore a monocle and made no eye contact. She had no family left in Philadelphia, no prospects that did not involve becoming a governess to someone else's children, and no patience left for the kind of refined man who would look at her the way every refined man had looked at her since she turned 21, as though she were a decorative object that had somehow survived past its period of usefulness. She had no use for refined men either. That was the secret truth she had carried all the way to Laramie, Wyoming, in the summer of 1882, riding 3 days on a train that smelled of coal smoke and the boots of strangers. She had carried it in her chest like a hidden motive she was not yet ready to name. And now she stood on this porch with the wind pulling at her hair and dust already working its way under her collar, and David Keene, who was no refined man and had made absolutely no pretense of being one, was telling her she was not good enough for his world either. That, Louise thought, was something she could not accept. "You wrote," she said, pulling herself up to her full height, which was not impressive by any objective measurement but felt formidable to her in that moment, "that you needed a capable woman, hardworking, willing to make a real life in rough country. I answered that advertisement because I am capable, because I am willing, and because I have worked harder in the past 3 months than most people work in 3 years. David looked at her for a long moment. Something moved in his expression, not softness, not yet, but something that was at least paying attention. "You wore white gloves on the train platform," he said. "I wore white gloves because I was wearing them when I left Philadelphia, and I did not see the point in taking them off in the middle of Kansas," Louise said. "I am not wearing them now." He looked at her hands. She had taken the gloves off 3 miles back, when the wagon hit a rut and she had grabbed the side rail to keep from being thrown, and the rough wood had caught on the thin cotton and she had simply pulled them off and stuffed them in her bag. Her hands were not soft anymore. They had not been soft in 3 months. Something shifted in David Keene's dark eyes. Something that looked, if she was reading it correctly, like the first faint hairline crack in a wall he had spent a long time building. "Come inside," he said. "I'll show you what this place actually is. Then you can decide if you still want to stay." She followed him through the front door of the ranch house, and the story of how Louise Gentry had come to be standing on that porch, holding her breath while the most difficult man she had ever encountered decided whether or not to give her a chance, began to unspool backward into the weeks and months that had led her here. It had started, as so many things do, with a letter. 3 months before she stood on David Keene's porch, Louise had been sitting at the desk in her late father's study, working through the final accounting of an estate that had turned out to be worth considerably less than anyone had suspected. Harold Gentry had been a man of enormous charm and very small financial discipline, and his death had revealed a landscape of hidden debts that Louise was only now beginning to fully map. The house on Sycamore Street would have to go. The furniture would have to go. The silver, the books, the small oil painting of her mother that she had hoped to keep, almost everything would have to go. There was a neighbor, a man named Mr. Holbrook, who had expressed a polite and persistent interest in Louise for several years. He was 44. He had a large house and a steady income from a dry goods import business. He wore his hair parted precisely in the center and always smelled of bay rum. He had called twice since her father's funeral, each time finding a way to work into the conversation the fact that his house had several spare rooms and that a woman of Louise's refinement deserved to be kept comfortable. Louise had thanked him politely and then gone back to her accounting. She was not interested in being kept comfortable by a man who looked at her the way Mr. Holbrook looked at her, as though she were a ledger entry being moved from one column to another, an asset he was acquiring rather than a person he was choosing. She had watched her mother live that kind of life for 20 years, maintained beautifully and kept at a polished distance, decorative and useless, a woman whose opinions had stopped being solicited sometime around the birth of her second child, who had never had a second child because she had not survived the first. Louise had been born to a woman who died giving her life, and raised by a man who loved her deeply and irresponsibly, and she had grown up in the gap between those two facts with a very clear understanding of what she wanted and what she did not. She did not want to be an ornament. She wanted to be necessary. It was that particular hunger that had made her pause at the back page of the Philadelphia Gazette on a Tuesday morning in late April of 1882, when she was supposed to be reviewing correspondence from the auction house. The advertisement was brief. It was, in fact, almost insulting in its brevity, compared to some of the longer notices she had read in similar columns on similar mornings, notices that made vast romantic promises about wide-open skies and a good Christian man with his own property. This one said, "Rancher in Wyoming Territory, 32, seeks capable woman for practical arrangement. Must be willing to work hard and endure rough conditions. No pretensions entertained. Sincerity required. Inquiries to D. Keene, Box 14, Laramie, Wyoming Territory. No pretensions entertained. Sincerity required." Louise had read it 3 times. Then she had put down the newspaper, looked out the window at the respectable gray street of her respectable gray neighborhood, thought about Mr. Holbrook's bay rum and his spare rooms and his ledger entry eyes, and picked up her pen. She wrote David Keene a letter that took her 4 drafts to get right. The first draft was too formal, too redolent of the parlor she was trying to leave behind. The second was too desperate, and desperation, she had always believed, was a smell that the wrong kind of man could detect at 100 yards. The third was too clever, too constructed, all careful architecture and no genuine material. The fourth draft was simply the truth. She wrote that she was 26, recently orphaned, financially reduced, and entirely serious. She wrote that she was educated but not decorative, capable of learning what she did not know, and that she had already decided the life she had been living was not the life she wanted. She wrote that she did not expect romance or poetry. She expected honest work and honest treatment and honest conversation, and she was prepared to offer all 3 in return. She sealed it, mailed it before she could reconsider, and then spent 2 weeks half convinced she had made a spectacular mistake. His reply came on a Thursday, and it was even shorter than the advertisement. Miss Gentry, your letter is the first honest one I have received. Come if you are serious. Train to Laramie, 3rd week of June. I will meet you at the station. D. Keene. She came. The train journey to Laramie, Wyoming took 3 days and 3 nights, and Louise spent them watching the country outside her window transform from the familiar, hemmed-in green of the eastern states into something vast and ungoverned that she had no prior vocabulary for. The plains opened up somewhere around western Illinois and did not stop opening until they reached Wyoming, where the landscape became something between beautiful and threatening in a way she had not expected. Hills the color of old honey, sky that looked like it had been stretched, wind that she could see bending the grass in long, rippling waves even from the inside of the train car. She arrived in Laramie in the middle of the afternoon, wearing her white gloves and a gray traveling dress that was already thoroughly dusted from the journey, and stood on the platform with her 2 bags, and looked around for a man who fit the limited sketch her imagination had assembled from 1 short letter and 1 shorter reply. David Keene was leaning against a post at the edge of the platform with his arms crossed, watching her the way a man watches something he has already decided he has an opinion about. He was taller than she had pictured, lean in a way that was purely functional rather than fashionable, his face weathered and sharp-angled, his clothes worn and clean. He had the look of a man who had never in his life considered how he appeared to other people, not out of carelessness, but out of a complete lack of interest in that particular calculation. He did not smile when she approached. He tipped his hat with a gesture that was perfunctory rather than warm, and he said, "Miss Gentry," in a voice that was low and level and reserved its judgment. "Mr. Keene," she said. He picked up her bags without asking, which she decided to interpret as practical rather than presumptuous, and led her to a wagon hitched at the far end of the street. The ride to the ranch took nearly 2 hours over unpaved road, and he did not say much during it, and she did not push, because she understood instinctively that silence was one of the currencies of this place, and she had best learn how to spend it wisely. She observed instead the grassland rolling away on all sides, the fence lines that marked the edge of what she understood to be his property, stretching away across the hills in weathered timber and wire. The cattle that moved in slow, dark clusters against the gold grass, the mountains visible as a blue suggestion on the far western horizon. All of it enormous, unhurried, indifferent to anything as small as a human being's plans or feelings. The ranch house was practical. That was the most honest word for it. It was built from timber and stone, substantial enough to stand firm against the Wyoming winters that David had apparently described in his journal, which she had not read, in terms that suggested they were genuinely lethal, and furnished in a way that indicated a man who owned what he needed and nothing more. A cast-iron stove, a sturdy table, 2 chairs that did not match, a rifle above the door, a shelf of books that surprised her, not many, but they were there, and they were not decorative. It was nothing like the house on Sycamore Street. It was nothing like anything Louise Gentry had ever lived in. It felt, in a way she could not have predicted from a train seat in Pennsylvania, like the first honest room she had ever stood in. And then he had said she was useless. Standing in the main room of the ranch house now, watching him light a lamp as the last of the evening light faded through the windows, Louise remembered that he had not actually used that word. He had said he had no use for a refined woman. There was a difference, she thought, and she filed it away for later. "I have 700 acres, David said, setting the lamp on the table with the unhurried economy of movement that seemed to characterize everything he did. 300 head of cattle, 2 ranch hands who bunk in the outbuilding, Tom Hale and Billy Forsyth. Tom's been with me 4 years. Billy started last spring." He paused, studying her in the lamplight. "This isn't a managed household. There is no one to give orders to. There is no social calendar. There is no one to impress. The work here is real work every day in every weather. I have seen men break under it. I am not a man, Louise said. No, he said, and something in his voice shifted almost imperceptibly toward dry. I had noticed. I mean that I understand the difference between what you are describing and what I come from, she said. I am not trying to bring Philadelphia here. I am trying to leave Philadelphia there. What I want to know is whether you are willing to judge me on what I actually do rather than on where I came from and what I was wearing when I stepped off the train. David looked at her for a long time. The lamp flame moved between them, and outside the wind had picked up, a low Wyoming wind that slid under the door and reminded her that she was a very long way from anywhere she had ever been before. Fair enough, he said finally. It was not an apology. It was not a welcome. But it was the first thing he had said to her that did not feel like a door being held shut. She slept that first night in the small room off the main one, which he had made up with plain, clean linen, and she lay awake for a while listening to the silence of the ranch, which was not actually silence at all, but a different kind of sound, the sound of cattle and wind and the settling of timber, the sound of a world that operated entirely without reference to her preferences. And she thought about the hidden motive she had carried from Philadelphia. She had not come to Wyoming to find love. She was clear on that point. She had come to find a life that was worth living, a life in which she was necessary and real rather than ornamental and theoretical. But she was also honest enough with herself to acknowledge that there had been something in David Keene's 2 letters, some quality of directness, some flavor of a man who did not perform anything, that had lodged itself somewhere in her chest like a splinter she had not yet decided to remove. She fell asleep telling herself it was nothing. The next morning, she woke before dawn because the ranch woke before dawn, and she dressed quickly in the most practical clothes she had brought, and walked out into the main room to find David already at the stove with coffee made and nothing else, clearly expecting her to either figure out breakfast or not. She figured out breakfast. She found flour and salt pork and dried beans and eggs from the half-dozen hens that, she discovered, lived in a small coop behind the house. She made biscuits with the practiced efficiency of a woman who had been running her own household since she was 17, and fried the salt pork, and had everything on the table by the time David came back in from his first round of morning checks. He sat down, looked at the food, and ate. He did not say it was good. He did not say anything. But he ate all of it, and when he was finished, he poured her a cup of coffee without being asked and set it in front of her. And she understood that this was, in the economy of David Keene, a significant gesture. Tom Hale turned out to be a weathered man of about 50, with a completely illegible face and surprising capacity for warmth once you got past the exterior. Billy Forsythe was 23 and enthusiastic in a way that seemed almost reckless in this landscape, with a wide, easy grin that reminded Louise of the kind of young men she had known in Philadelphia who had been pleasant and useless and entirely harmless. She liked Billy immediately. Tom, she understood, would take longer. The first week was an education in ways Louise had not anticipated. She had expected physical difficulty, and she got it. The work of the ranch was genuinely hard in ways that her hands and back were not accustomed to, and she went asleep each night with an ache in her muscles that was different from any tiredness she had ever felt, a deeper tiredness, a complete and satisfying tiredness, the kind that came from having used her body entirely rather than merely having moved it from room to room. What she had not expected was the education in herself. David Keene, she discovered, was not unkind. He was reserved. He was demanding, in the sense that he expected people to do what they said they would and to do it well, but he was not cruel about it. When she made mistakes, and she made them, the first week was full of small catastrophes that she catalogued grimly in her memory. He corrected her without contempt, with a directness that she found, once she stopped flinching from it, more respectful than the elaborate courtesy she had grown up surrounded by. He showed her how to read the cattle for signs of illness without making her feel like an idiot for not already knowing. He showed her how the well worked and what to watch for in the rope, and he explained the fence lines with the patient thoroughness of a man who understood that information was useful, and there was no reason to withhold it. He did not baby her. He also did not dismiss her. On the fourth day, a section of fence on the north pasture came down overnight. One of the cedar posts had rotted through at the base, and 3 cows got out into the neighboring land before anyone noticed. Louise was the first one to notice, as it happened, because she had gone out in the early morning to look at the sky, which she had already learned to watch as an instrument of prediction, and she had seen the cattle in the wrong place and gone immediately to find David before she had even made coffee. He looked at her with something new in his expression when she told him, not quite respect, not yet, but the beginning of the reconsideration of a conclusion he had already drawn. They spent the morning bringing the cattle back and repairing the fence. Louise worked alongside Tom and Billy, learning the vocabulary of post-hole diggers and wire stretchers, and by noon she had blisters on 3 fingers and had contributed in a way that was, if not expert, at least genuine. At noon, eating cold biscuits and leftover beans at the fence line because there was no time to go back to the house, David said to her without preamble, "You didn't panic." "No," she agreed. "Most people would have." "I was not raised to panic," she said. "I was raised to pour tea and play piano and panic on the inside." Tom made a sound that might have been a laugh. Billy actually laughed. David's mouth moved in what Louise was beginning to recognize as his version of a smile, a very slight, very controlled movement at the corners, as though he were allowing himself a small pleasure but had not yet committed to enjoying it fully. That was the moment, she thought afterward. That was the moment the wall started showing more cracks. The weeks that followed had a rhythm to them that Louise found she needed in a way she had not known she needed anything. Each morning brought specific work: cooking, managing the household stores, helping with the cattle on the days when extra hands were useful, learning the geography of the ranch acre by acre, fence line by fence line. Each evening brought the particular quiet of a ranch after dark, when the work was done and the fire was burning and the outside world was very far away. She and David did not talk a great deal in those first weeks, but the quality of their silence changed. It moved from the loaded, cautious silence of 2 strangers assessing each other's potential for damage to something that felt more like a shared language, a silence that communicated ease rather than wariness, that said we know where we both are and there is nothing to prove in the space between words. She learned him in pieces. He had been born in Missouri, the 3rd son of a farmer who had come west after the war and not come back east. His father had died when David was 19, leaving him a debt and a reputation for stubbornness. He had worked his way to Wyoming through a sequence of jobs that had included cattle driving, surveying work, and one winter trapping that he mentioned once and never mentioned again, with an expression that suggested it was a chapter of his life best kept closed. He had bought the first 50 acres of what was now his ranch at 24 with money he had been saving for 8 years. He had built it alone, acre by acre, head by head, in the methodical way that he built everything without haste, without sentiment, without wasted motion. He had never been married. Louise did not ask why, but Tom Hale told her. One afternoon when they were working together in the barn, and the topic arose naturally from a discussion of the land and its difficulty, that David had been engaged once, 6 years prior, to a woman from Laramie who had come to see the ranch in November, and decided by December that she could not live so far from town. He had not been angry about it, Tom said. He had just gone quiet in the way a man goes quiet when he reaches a conclusion he intends to act on permanently, and the conclusion had apparently been that a woman who valued the refinements of town life was not a woman who could share his world. Louise thought about this for several days. She thought about it when she was making bread, and when she was repairing a split seam in one of the curtains with the plain linen thread she had found in the bottom of a supply box, and when she was standing at the well in the blue early morning watching the last stars fade. She understood, she thought, what had happened to David Keene with that woman from Laramie. She understood it not because she was perceptive in any special way, but because she had come from the same general category, the world of parlors and calls and social calendars, and she knew from the inside exactly how that world looked at places like this ranch, like this Wyoming land. It looked at them the way you look at a painting of a wild place, admirable from a safe distance, unthinkable to actually inhabit. She was not looking at this place from a safe distance. She was standing in it with blistered hands and mud on her boots, and a profound and growing certainty that she had been right to come. The problem was David Keene himself. Not as an obstacle exactly, but as a force she had not calculated when she set out from Philadelphia. She had expected a practical man. She had found a man who was practical, yes, but who was also something else, something that she kept circling without being able to name, the way you circle a fire you are not sure is safe to get too close to. He was honest in a way that went deeper than manners. When something was wrong, he said it was wrong. When something worked, he acknowledged it without embellishment. He did not perform kindness, but he practiced it. In the quiet way he put her coffee on the table, in the way he had rebuilt the chicken coop door when he noticed the latch was stiff without being asked, in the way he showed her the parts of the ranch she had not yet seen as though offering her something he valued and wanted her to understand. He was also, she realized one evening about 3 weeks in, beautiful in a way she had been carefully not noticing. She had been noticing it, of course. She was honest with herself about that. The particular line of him working in the late light, the unhurried competence of everything he did, the way his voice sounded in the evening quiet when he did choose to speak. These were things she had been cataloging with a care that was not entirely practical. The evening she admitted it to herself, she was sitting at the table with a book she had brought from Philadelphia, a novel that felt very distant from where she was now, and David was at the other end of the table reading something, some accounting journal or survey record, and the fire was burning. And outside the Wyoming wind was doing what it always did, which was everything, and she looked at him across the table and thought, I am in serious trouble. The complication that she had not anticipated arrived on a Wednesday in mid-July. His name was Roland Marsh, and he came to the ranch in a good buggy with a good suit and the kind of easy, practiced charm that Louise recognized immediately, because she had spent 26 years in rooms full of men who wore it. He was in his mid-30s, handsome in a managed way, and he smiled at her with precisely the right degree of warmth to communicate that he found her attractive while maintaining the veneer of respectability. He explained to David over coffee that Louise made, and then stayed to pour because she did not intend to be excluded from conversations held in her own kitchen, a land agent from Cheyenne. He was in the area representing several Eastern investment interests who were in the process of consolidating land holdings in the territory, and he had heard his sources, he said, were excellent, that David Keene's 700 acres sat directly between two parcels already under acquisition, and would, if added to the portfolio, create a property that would be quite valuable indeed. He had come to make an offer. David's face did not change by so much as a single degree during this speech. He sat with his coffee and listened until Roland Marsh finished, and then he said, "No." Roland Marsh's smile widened by a calculated fraction. He had clearly come prepared for no. He presented a number that was, even by Louise's uninformed assessment, significantly more than the land was worth in strict terms. He talked about the changing economics of cattle, about the railroad expansion, about the eastern capital that was remaking the territory. He had the easy authority of a man who had learned early that money, presented with enough confidence, has a tendency to rearrange people's thinking. David said, "The answer is no. I won't sell." After Roland Marsh left, the dust from his good buggy settling slowly back onto the road, David stood at the fence line for a long time. Louise came to stand nearby, not too close, and looked at the same horizon. "He'll come back," she said. "I know," David said. "Is there something you are not telling me?" she asked. She had learned by now to ask directly rather than to maneuver toward a question because he responded to directness and had no patience for maneuvering. He was quiet for a moment that she let be quiet. "There is a water source on the north end of my property," he said then. "A spring that runs year-round. Marsh's clients know about it. It's the real reason they want this land." He paused. "The whole range around here depends on that water in dry years. If someone buys it and charges access or fences it, it could ruin every small operation within 40 miles. Louise looked at him. He was not looking at her. He was looking at the land in the way that she had come to understand was not just seeing but a kind of ongoing conversation with the thing he loved most in the world. "Then we won't sell," she said. The "we" landed between them like a stone dropped in still water. She felt it the moment it left her mouth, the way it claimed something, and she felt him feel it too in the almost imperceptible shift of his weight, the tiny pause before he answered. "No," he said, and this time there was something in the word that had not been there before. "We won't." Roland Marsh came back the following week, as promised, and the week after that. He came each time with a higher number, and each time David said no in the same level voice, and each time Roland Marsh smiled and said he would be in touch. He also, each time, found ways to speak directly to Louise with a warmth that was clearly calculating, complimenting the coffee, asking about where she was from, finding excuses to make her feel seen and regarded, as though she were a lever he had identified and was methodically testing. Louise was not a lever. She was also not unaware of what he was doing. On his fourth visit, Roland Marsh stayed for nearly an hour, and at some point, while David had stepped outside briefly with Tom Hale to look at something with one of the cattle, he said to Louise, quite quietly and with the practiced intimacy of a man who believed charm was a universal solvent, "You are a remarkable woman to have ended up here, Miss Gentry. I imagine this is not quite the life you had in mind." "It is exactly the life I had in mind," Louise said pleasantly. "A woman of your background," Roland said, with a knowing smile that she found genuinely irritating, "deserves more than rough country and hard work." "More," Louise said, "or different?" "Because I have had the kind of life you seem to be recommending, Mr. Marsh, and I found it considerably less satisfying than this one." Something shifted in Roland Marsh's expression, not quite anger but a recalibration, the adjustment of a man who realizes a calculation was wrong. He recovered quickly. He always recovered quickly, she suspected. "Just making conversation," he said smoothly. "Of course," she said. When David came back in, he looked between them with the quick, accurate reading of a man who had spent years watching cattle and weather for signs of what was coming. And something hardened slightly in his eyes that he did not explain, and she did not ask about until that evening. She asked that evening, sitting at the table after dinner with the lamp burning low between them, whether he trusted Roland Marsh. "I don't trust men who want things other people aren't willing to give," David said. "Do you trust me?" she asked. It was the most direct thing she had said to him, possibly in the weeks she had been there. The question was larger than it sounded, and they both knew it. It was asking not just about Marsh, but about all of it, about where she had come from and why she was here, and whether the wall between them was still up, or whether those hairline cracks had been accumulating toward something. He looked at her. The lamp moved between them. Outside, the night was doing the enormous, indifferent thing that Wyoming nights did, full of stars and dark and wind. "Yes," he said, "just that." But it was the way he said it, not as a concession but as a fact, as something he had apparently already concluded and was simply reporting, and it hit her somewhere behind the sternum with a warmth she had not been prepared for. The trouble with Roland Marsh escalated, as Louise had known it would, in the third week of August. She had ridden out to the north fence to check the water levels at the spring, a task that had become hers, because she had taken it on without being asked and done it well, and because David trusted her report, and she found Roland Marsh there before her, standing at the edge of the spring with another man she did not recognize, A large man in a dark coat who had the look of someone who enforced things for a living. "Miss Gentry," Roland said with his practiced smile and no explanation whatsoever of what he was doing on private property. "Mr. Marsh," she said levelly, "this is not your land." "Not yet," he said. Then, as though he were being helpful rather than threatening, "You should talk to Keene. I have a new offer, considerably better than the last. He'd be a fool to keep saying no." He looked at the spring. "And there are other ways to make a piece of land undesirable if a man won't sell reasonably." It was not a direct threat. It was the kind of thing a careful man says when he wants to communicate danger while maintaining deniability. Louise kept her face neutral, looked at him for exactly one beat, then turned her horse and rode back to the ranch. She told David everything, including the specific words, including her impression of the man in the dark coat, including the way Roland Marsh had looked at the spring with the proprietary certainty of a man who had decided the outcome and was merely waiting for the procedure. David listened without interrupting. His expression did not change much, but something in the stillness of him became a different kind of stillness, the kind that precedes action rather than patience. "I need to go to Laramie," he said. "Talk to the sheriff and to a lawyer I know there. This needs to be on record before anything else happens." He paused. "I don't want to leave the ranch." "I can stay," Louise said. "Tom and Billy will be here." He looked at her with the particular attention he used when he was deciding something. "I'll be back by Thursday," he said. He was gone 2 days and Louise ran the ranch. She made decisions about the cattle rotation that Tom Hale agreed with after a moment of assessing her on the new authority the situation had created. And she kept watch on the north fence line. And she wrote a careful record of everything she had seen and heard at the spring, because she understood instinctively that documentation was a weapon, and she was a person who knew how to use words. He came back on Wednesday evening, not Thursday, riding faster than usual, and the look on his face when he came through the door was the look of a man who has learned something that changes the dimensions of a problem. He sat down at the table. She put coffee in front of him. "The lawyer says Marsh's clients have already filed a claim on 3 adjacent properties," David said. "They are using a provision in the Land Act that allows for reassessment of water rights if a property can be shown to be economically unproductive. They are going to argue that my ranch is underproducing and that the water source should be classified as a public resource under their management." "That is not what the law says," Louise said. "No," David agreed, "but it is what a very expensive lawyer from back east can make it look like if the local records are improperly filed." He looked at her. "My original land claim has a clerical error in the boundary description, a number that was transposed. It was never corrected because it never mattered." "It matters now," Louise said. "It matters now," he said. "If they get before a territorial judge with that error highlighted, they can argue the boundary is in dispute and the spring falls outside my legal claim." Louise looked at him. She thought about the land she had been learning for months, every fence line, every contour of grass. Every morning she had walked the property and let it become hers. She thought about the hidden motive she had carried from Philadelphia, the need to be necessary, to be real rather than ornamental, and she thought that this was the moment for it. "I can fix the filing," she said. David looked at her. "What?" "The original land claim," she said. "Where is it filed?" "Laramie." "The Territorial Land Office," he said. "Yes. I can go to Laramie, make a formal application to correct a clerical error in the original filing, and document the correction before Marsh's people can file their claim. The process for correcting a boundary description clerical error is straightforward if there is supporting evidence, and we have supporting evidence: your original survey, the fence line records, and the neighbor testimonies about the spring's location." She paused. "I know how to do this. My father's estate had 3 filing errors that I corrected personally before the auction." He stared at her for a moment in which she could see him recalibrating something fundamental. "You know land law," he said. "I know how to find the right form and fill it out correctly," she said. "Which is, In my experience, about 70% of the law. Something that was entirely and unmistakably a smile moved across David Keene's face. Not the controlled, cautious almost smile she had been collecting and cataloging for weeks. A real one. It was only there for a moment, but it was there, and it changed his face entirely, and Louise felt it in her chest like a struck match. "When can you leave?" he said. She went to Laramie the next morning with David and Tom Hale, and she spent 4 hours in the Territorial Land Office speaking with a clerk who was initially dismissive. And then, as she laid out the supporting documentation in the precise and logical order she had prepared the night before, became increasingly cooperative. She filed the correction. She filed the supporting survey evidence. She filed a formal record of the spring's location within the corrected boundary. She made 3 copies of everything. Roland Marsh appeared at the land office that afternoon with his man in the dark coat and a lawyer who was indeed expensive and well-dressed, and he found that the correction had already been filed, already stamped, already entered in the territorial record. The timing was 4 hours ahead of his own filing. The clerk, when asked, was technically unable to assist with a claim that conflicted with a properly corrected record already in the system. Roland Marsh looked at Louise in the corridor of the land office with an expression that had finally run out of charm and said, very quietly, "You have made an enemy, Miss Gentry." "I have made one before," she said. "They tend to manage." He left. His lawyer looked at the filing one more time with the resigned expression of a man who is paid by the hour and does not personally care about the outcome, and then he left too. On the street outside the land office, David Keene stood next to her in the Laramie afternoon sun, and he did not say anything for a moment, and then he said, "Thank you." 2 words, but coming from him they carried the weight of a much longer speech. "You are welcome," she said. They stood there in the sun for another moment, and then, with a naturalness that surprised her, he put his hand over hers where it rested on the hitching post and left it there. His hand was calloused and warm and entirely matter-of-fact about itself, and Louise looked at it for a moment and then looked at him, and he was looking at her with that dark, direct gaze of his, and the hidden motive she had been carrying since Philadelphia was not hidden anymore. She was in love with him. She had been in love with him for some time, probably, if she was being honest, which she generally tried to be. It had accumulated quietly and persistently in the weeks of shared mornings and lamplight evenings, and 100 small moments of genuine regard, and now it was as present and undeniable as the Wyoming landscape around them, enormous and unhurried and entirely indifferent to how inconvenient she found it. He was still looking at her. She thought, from the quality of his expression, that careful, attending look that he used when something mattered to him, that he might be arriving at a similar conclusion from his own direction. The ride back to the ranch was different from all the other rides. He rode close to her. Not dramatically close, not in a way that performed anything, just in the natural way of 2 people who have stopped needing the buffer of managed distance between them. They talked more than usual, not about the filing or Marsh, but about small things, the way the late summer grass looked, the question of whether to add another section of fence on the west pasture before winter, the book he had been reading that she had noticed on the shelf and wanted to ask about. And then, when they were nearly back, in the long amber light of late afternoon with the ranch visible ahead of them, he said without preamble in the way that was entirely his own, "I need to say something." "All right," she said. "I was wrong," he said. "What I said the day you arrived, about having no use for a refined woman," he looked at the road ahead. "I said it because I had a fear I didn't examine closely enough, and I dressed it up as a practical objection. That was not fair to you." Louise looked at his profile. She thought about the wall and all its cracks, about the weeks of careful, honest work by 2 people who were both, in different ways, trying to stop being afraid of the same thing. "You were also not entirely wrong," she said. "I came here refined in all the ways that word means when it is not a compliment. I have been unrefined by this place, by the work, by you." She paused. I am grateful for all of it." He looked at her then, and the look was open in a way she had not seen before, stripped of the last of the reservation he had been maintaining, and she understood that this was what David Keene looked like when he was not protecting himself from anything. He said, "I have not been looking for anything except the ranch for a long time. I told myself that was enough." "Was it?" she asked. "No," he said, "but I had gotten very good at telling myself it was." They rode the rest of the way in a silence that was the warmest kind of silence, the kind that does not need to be filled because it is already full. That evening after dinner, when Tom and Billy had gone to the bunkhouse and the ranch was settling into its nighttime sounds, they sat at the table as they had sat 100 evenings, but the room felt different. Something had been set down that had been carried a long way. "Louise," he said, and the use of her first name, which he had not used before, was itself a kind of declaration. "Yes," she said, before he could say anything else, because she knew what the question was going to be and she had the answer ready. He looked at her with a brief expression that might have been relief, might have been something much larger than relief in a smaller container, and then he reached across the table and took her hand the way he had in Laramie, without ceremony, without performance, just plainly and completely. They sat there in the lamplight while the Wyoming night did its enormous, indifferent, beautiful thing outside, and the secret Louise had been carrying since Philadelphia was no longer a secret and no longer a weight, but something warm and deliberate in hers. The autumn that followed was the richest season of Louise Gentry's life. She had not expected Joy to feel the way it felt on a Wyoming ranch in October, with the grass going gold and the first cold coming down from the mountains. But she found it to be the most complete and specific joy she had ever experienced, joy that was made of real things rather than abstractions, of the smell of bread and cold air and leather, of a man's voice in the morning, and the particular satisfaction of work done well and honestly. David was different with her now. Not unrecognizable, he was still reserved, still quiet in the way she had learned to understand, still the man who expressed more by his actions than his words and expected the same consideration in return. But the wall was down, and what was behind it was everything she had suspected it might be. A person of genuine depth, of humor that was dry and unexpected and always worth waiting for, of tenderness that he expressed in practical ways because those were the ways available to him and he used them fully. He loved her. She understood this not from declarations, though he made them, but from the 1,000 daily evidences of a man who had organized his life around another person's well-being with the same methodical care he brought to everything else. He taught her to ride well, not just adequately. He taught her to read the cattle and the weather and the land. He showed her the north end of the property in early autumn, where the spring ran clear and cold out of the hillside, and the cottonwoods had turned yellow, and he sat beside her on the rock above the water and told her about his father and about Missouri and about the winter trapping, which was a chapter he had decided, apparently, to share with her after all. She told him about Philadelphia and her father and her mother, about growing up in a household of charm and financial chaos, about Mr. Holbrook and his bay rum eyes, about the accumulating weight of a life that asked only to be decorative and the bone-deep relief of being asked instead to be real. He listened to all of it with the full attention he gave to things that mattered. October became November, and November brought the first serious cold, and David asked her, one evening in mid-November with the stove burning high and the first real snow visible through the window, whether she would marry him. He asked it plainly, as he did everything. He said that he knew this was not the kind of proposal a woman from Philadelphia might have imagined, that there was no romantic setting being arranged, and no significant piece of jewelry being offered, that what he had to give her was the ranch and the work and himself, and that he understood if she wanted something different or more. She told him she had had different and more and found it considerably less satisfying. She said yes. They were married in Laramie in December, at the small church on the main street, with Tom Hale and Billy Forsythe as witnesses and a minister who had married more ranching couples than he could count, and had a practical, warm efficiency about the ceremony that suited them both exactly. Louise wore a blue dress she had made herself from wool cloth she had ordered from the dry goods store, and David wore his good coat, which was clean and pressed, and still unmistakably the coat of a working rancher rather than a gentleman, and she thought she had never seen him look better. They drove back to the ranch through a light snowfall, and the world was white and quiet and entirely theirs. The winter was hard, as Wyoming winters were, but Louise had been prepared for hard and found she was suited to it in a way she had not predicted when she read the advertisement in the Philadelphia Gazette 6 months ago on a gray spring morning. The ranch in winter was a different world. The work contracted around the essential and urgent, the cold demanding a constant vigilance that left no room for anything unnecessary, and the long dark evenings stretching out in the warmth of the house, with a man she loved and books and firelight, and the particular happiness of a life that was genuinely hers. She wrote letters to no one in Philadelphia, because there was no one left to write to, but she kept a journal in which she recorded the ranch and the seasons and her own evolution through both, and she was conscious, writing in it, of being a person who had arrived somewhere real. Spring came back to Wyoming with the specific, almost violent joy of a country that has been genuinely cold and is now genuinely not. The grass came back green and tremendous, the cattle spread out across it in the particular contentment of animals returned to their proper element, and the ranch came back to full life in every direction. Roland Marsh did not return. The territorial land office records were clear and correct. The investment interests from back east, apparently finding the consolidated land plan less profitable without the spring, had redirected their attention elsewhere. Tom Hale reported, through his network of information that stretched across the ranching community in ways Louise had come to respect, that the adjacent properties that had been purchased were now sitting largely idle, which was exactly the kind of outcome that followed when a land scheme lost its organizing element. David told her one spring morning, standing at the fence with coffee, that he wanted to expand the herd. "To how many head?" she asked. 500, he said, "if the season holds. The north pasture can support it if we rotate through the east fence sooner," she said. "I have been watching the grass." He looked at her with the expression that was one of her favorites, the one that said he found her consistently surprising in ways he valued. "I know you have," he said. Billy Forsythe, in the spring of that year, began a tentative courtship of the daughter of the nearest neighboring ranching family, a woman named Clara Ames who was 22 and sensible and clearly delighted by Billy's enthusiasm. Louise watched this development with the warm interest of a person who has recently been through something similar and knows which parts are worth encouraging and which moments require patience. Tom Hale watched it with the illegible face and then, one evening when Louise found herself alone with him for a moment in the barn, said to her with the directness she had come to associate with men who had been in rough country long enough to stop going sideways at things, "You have been good for this ranch." And for him, he did not need to say who he meant. "He has been good for me," Louise said. Tom nodded once, as though a matter had been settled. The summer of 1883 was full and hard and deeply satisfying. The herd expanded. The fences held. There were no more visits from men in good buggies with Eastern investment schemes, and the North Spring ran clear and cold through the dry weeks of late July as it had always run, providing water to every small operation within range that needed it. In October of 1883, Louise told David that they were expecting a child. She told him in the morning, because she was not a woman who held important information for a dramatic moment. She simply told him at breakfast, with the coffee on the table and the morning coming in through the window, and watched the thing happen to his face. He was quiet for a moment. She watched what quiet meant in this case, not the cautious reserve she had learned in their first weeks, not the wall. This was a different kind of stillness, the kind that precedes something large. He stood up and crossed the room and held her face in both his calloused hands with a tenderness so deliberate and complete that she felt it in every part of her, and he did not say anything for a moment, and then he said her name again, Louise, in the voice that still hit her like the first time. Yes, she said, as she had said before. He kissed her. Not a gentle kiss, but a complete one, the kind that is also a conversation. That evening he told Tom and Billy, who responded respectively with a single satisfied nod and an explosion of congratulatory noise that sent the horses in the near corral sideways. The winter of 1883 was the winter that Louise stopped being afraid of Wyoming's cold, because the cold was no match for the warmth of the life she had built inside it. She grew large and comfortable in the ranch house, adapting her work to the season of her body with the practicality she brought to everything, accepting help where it was useful and refusing it where it was not. And she read and sewed and kept the accounts with the meticulous accuracy that had become one of the ranch's great assets. And she watched David move through the house with a new kind of care, not less like himself, but more. The way a room with a lamp in it is more itself than the room was in the dark. Their son was born in late March of 1884 in the ranch house, with the help of a midwife from Laramie who had made the cold ride without complaint and been eminently capable throughout. He was healthy and loud about it, which the midwife said was exactly what you wanted, and David held him with the careful competence of a man who has handled valuable things and knows that careful does not mean distant. They named him James Harold Keene. James for no particular ancestor, because David had no particular ancestors he was honoring, and Harold for Louise's father, because she did want to honor hers, the irresponsible, charming, genuinely loving man who had given her life and left her with the skills to save herself when he could not. James was a loud, vigorous baby with David's dark eyes and Louise's stubborn determination, and the ranch adapted around him, the way the ranch adapted around everything, by absorbing it into the rhythm and making it part of the necessary. Billy Forsythe married Clara Ames in the summer of 1884, in a ceremony at the Ames Ranch that was louder and more festive than Louise and David's had been, with dancing in the yard and more food than anyone could account for, and Tom Hale standing at the edge of it, all with his illegible face, occasionally nodding in a way that meant he approved. The years built themselves on the foundation of that first difficult, honest year. David and Louise built them the way David built everything methodically, without waste, with a clear eye on what mattered and the willingness to do the work to get there. The ranch grew. Not wildly, not in the reckless way of men who mistook expansion for progress, but steadily, in the way of something genuinely alive, a new section of fence here, a new arrangement with the neighboring operation there, a careful increase in the herd that the land could support without damage to what made the land worth having. The spring on the north end continued to flow. The grass continued to return each spring with its particular Wyoming extravagance. Louise ran the household, and the accounts with an authority that had grown from earned competence into something that everyone on the ranch and in the surrounding community recognized without needing to discuss. She was not managing David's ranch. She was managing their ranch, and the distinction was not semantic. She rode every fence line she had learned in that first autumn, and she learned more. She knew the cattle the way she had come to know everything here, by patient, daily observation, by asking when she did not know and remembering the answers, by trusting her own accumulating knowledge rather than deferring to the idea that there were things she was not equipped to understand. When James was 2, she began quietly educating herself on territorial law and water rights, reading what she could find and corresponding with the lawyer in Laramie who had helped with the land office filing. Not because there was an immediate threat, but because she had learned that the best time to understand a thing was before you needed to, and because the world they were building was worth protecting with the sharpest tools available. David watched all of this with the sustained attention of a man who has found the person he was supposed to be looking for and intends to keep paying attention. He was not a man who expressed himself in excess. He still said what he meant in as few words as possible and expected the world to accept that standard. But he told her he loved her every day in the morning, without embellishment, as though it were simply a fact being reported, which was exactly what it was. The winter she was expecting their second child. There was a week in January when a storm came down from the north that was serious even by Wyoming standards. 3 days of driven snow and temperatures that required constant attention to the cattle and the water supply and the fuel for the stove. Tom Hale's hands were badly chilled after the second day, and Billy came in with a cut on his forearm from a piece of wire that had snapped in the cold, and Louise cleaned it and bound it with the efficient calm of a woman who had long since stopped being surprised by what the ranch required of her. On the third day of the storm, when the worst was over and the sky had gone that particular blinding blue that follows Wyoming blizzards, David came in from the final check of the cattle and stood in the doorway with snow on his coat and his face red from cold, and he looked at her across the room with an expression that was simple and enormous and entirely itself. And she felt, as she had felt 100 times and expected to feel 100 times more, the struck-match warmth of it. "Everyone all right?" She asked. "Everyone's all right," he said, "all accounted for." "Sit down," she said. "I have coffee." He sat down. She brought coffee. He put his hand over hers on the table, in the way he had at the hitching post in Laramie on the day she fixed the land filing, with that same plain, complete, matter-of-fact warmth. Outside, the snow was brilliant and the sky was enormous and the Wyoming wind was quiet for once, resting, as though it too had spent 3 days working hard and had earned its stillness. Their daughter was born in April of 1885, a spring baby, arriving into the smell of returning grass and the particular sound of the ranch waking from winter. She was small and emphatic and had Louise's coloring, and what David identified, with the dry certainty of a man who recognized his own traits when he saw them in a new configuration, as his own stubbornness. They named her Ruth Ellen Keene. Ruth because Louise had been reading the book of Ruth that winter and found in it something that resonated with the particular choice she had made 3 years prior, the choice to follow into unfamiliar land and make it home. Ellen for David's mother, whom he had not spoken of often but whose photograph sat on the shelf beside the books, a woman with a direct gaze and composed posture who looked, Louise had always thought, like someone she would have understood. James, aged 2, received his sister with a mixture of suspicion and delight that resolved itself over several weeks into the protective attachment of a firstborn who has decided an addition is acceptable. Tom Hale, looking at the baby being held by David in the doorway of the ranch house, said one of the longest things Louise had ever heard him say, "Family suits this place." David looked at Louise. She looked back. "Yes," she said, "it does." The years had a momentum now, a forward motion that felt entirely different from the drifting progress of her Philadelphia life. Each season brought specific work and specific satisfactions, and the ranch built itself around the family that was building itself around the ranch, and Louise came to understand that this was what she had been looking for in those gray spring mornings on Sycamore Street: not comfort, not security, not the bay rum safety of Mr. Holbrook's spare rooms, but this specific, irreplaceable daily realness. She was necessary. Not in the performing sense, not in the way that a decorative object is necessary to the atmosphere of a room, but in the way that water is necessary, the way the spring on the north end of the property was necessary, because people and things she loved depended on what she provided, and she provided it every day with the full force of herself. And she was loved. Not in the elaborate, performative way she had watched men perform love in Philadelphia drawing rooms, not flowers and careful speeches and the managed warmth of social obligation, but in the way David Keene did everything, plainly and consistently, and without any of it being wasted on effect. She was loved the way the land was cared for, with attention to what it actually needed, with patience through the difficult seasons, with the quiet confidence of a person who intends to be here for every subsequent year that comes. One evening in the autumn of James's third year, with Ruth on her knee and James asleep already, and David across the table working through the year's accounting, Louise put down her mending and looked at the room around her, the lamp, the stove, the shelf of books, the rifle above the door, the window with the enormous dark Wyoming sky visible through it. And she thought about the woman who had sat in her father's study 3 years ago, reading a cattle auction advertisement that had changed her life. That woman had been looking for a life that was real. She had found it. She had found it in the roughest and most honest way available, in a landscape that had no use for pretension and no patience for anything that was not genuine, alongside a man who had once told her, bluntly and incorrectly, that he had no use for a refined woman. She was not a refined woman anymore. She was something considerably better, a woman who knew what she was worth and had found a place and a person that were worth the same. "David," she said. He looked up from the accounts. Dark eyes in the lamplight, still capable of stopping her mid-thought the way they always had. "I need to tell you something," she said. "All right," he said in that level voice. "I am happy," she said. "I want you to know that. I am completely, specifically, honestly happy." He looked at her for a moment. Something moved in his face, the full, real version of the smile she had first seen in Laramie on the day of the land office filing, the one that changed his whole face and was worth every bit of the waiting she had done to see it. "I know," he said. "So am I." He reached across the table and covered her hand with his, and she turned her hand over to hold his back, and the ranch went on around them in its steady, unhurried rhythm. The cattle settled in the cold autumn dark, the horses quiet in the barn, the spring on the north end running clear over stone in the silence, the fence lines holding, the grass resting for winter, and the enormous Wyoming sky doing what it always did, stretching away in every direction over a world that was honest and indifferent and entirely worth loving. James woke at some point in the night and called out, the clear, imperious sound of a 3-year-old who has important business. Louise went to him and settled him, and came back to find David still at the table but the accounts set aside, and he looked at her when she came in with the lamp warm between them, and she sat down across from him, and they sat together in the quiet for a while, the way they had sat on so many evenings, two people who had been looking for something real and had found it in each other in this land. In this life that was nothing like what either of them had once imagined, and exactly what both of them had needed. There were other winters, other springs, other storms that required all of them, and then gave way to the blue aftermath that made Wyoming beautiful in the particular way of things that have just demonstrated their power. The ranch grew and held. The children grew, James becoming serious and capable, and more like his father every year in ways that moved Louise deeply, and Ruth becoming fast-talking and precise, and clearly in possession of an intelligence that was going to require considerable management and considerable appreciation. Billy Forsythe and Clara had 2 children of their own, and the small community of the ranch expanded into the neighboring operations in the natural way of people who depend on each other through enough hard seasons to build something genuine. Tom Hale finally told them one autumn evening with his usual economy that he had been corresponding with a widow in Laramie named Mrs. Patricia Cole, that they had determined through correspondence and 2 visits that they were suited, and that they intended to marry in the spring. David shook his hand. Louise kissed his cheek, which made Tom's face do something unprecedented that she chose to interpret as delight. The land held. The water held. The life held. And on a September evening in 1887, 5 years after Louise had stepped off the train at Laramie in her white gloves with her 2 bags and her hidden motive and her absolute determination not to be an ornament any longer, she stood at the north fence line in the last of the evening light with David beside her, and she looked at the spring running silver out of the hillside, and the grass going gold around them, and the mountains blue on the horizon. And she thought that if she had to describe the life she had wanted when she sat in her father's study in Philadelphia reading the back page of the Gazette, she could not have described it better than what was right here, right now, in every direction she could see. "What are you thinking?" David asked. He asked her this from time to time, which was one of the many evidences of his love, that he remained curious about what was inside her mind after all these years, that he had not stopped asking. "I am thinking," she said, "about the woman I was when I arrived here, what she would think if she could see this." He was quiet for a moment in the comfortable Wyoming way. "What would she think?" he asked. "She would think," Louise said, "that it was better than she had hoped and harder than she had imagined, and that she would choose it again every single time." David turned and looked at her in the long September light. His face was still sharp-angled and weathered, still beautiful in the way she had been carefully not noticing the first time she saw it, and had been openly acknowledging ever since, still the face of a man who expressed what he felt directly and without wasted motion. "So would I," he said. He took her hand. She leaned against him, there at the fence line with the spring running and the last light going and the enormous sky above them preparing itself for night, and the ranch spread out behind them in its steady, unglamorous, wholly magnificent reality. 700 acres of Wyoming grassland and fence lines and cattle, and a house with a lamp in it and 2 children, and a life that was genuinely, completely, honestly theirs. The woman who had no use for refined men had found a man who had no use for refinement, and in the space between those two true things, they had built something that was better than either of them had been capable of imagining alone. Something that was real and permanent and alive in all the ways that matter. The spring ran on. The fence held. The light faded and came back as it always did, as it always would, over this land, over this life, over 2 people who had chosen each other with the same plain, deliberate honesty with which they faced everything, and who had found in choosing that they had chosen exactly right.